that I was donor conceived, and there was a certain parameters of what I should think about, and I don't need to think any further about who my donor was because it was a medical thing. I didn't even think of it as a person. It was only in my 20s that I started realizing that there was bigger ramifications for me, and that I seemed to have far more enthusiasm about supporting other people, my friends' identity, than my own, because I didn't really understand my own identity. And the argument that I'm here to present to you is that reproductive technology is inherently adult-centric, that particularly where I've been seeing it in practice, for example, in England, there's very little to counter the conflicts of interest from the infertility industry and its users, that there's an ethical and a legal duty to protect genetic relatedness for all groups of society, even potential human beings. There's an ethical and arguably a legal duty to respond with an apology, acknowledgement, reparation and services for the genetic discontinuity that's already been created for us. And there's an ethical and legal duty to help address the problems created for offspring, like safeguarding our records, gene libraries to help us link up with genetic kin. The people who are targeted as donors and the people who are created by the industry are also stakeholders that have separate interests that need to represent themselves. And there's a conflict of interests when you've got the industry itself and the industry users basically calling all the shots. Ultimately, there's a huge amount of profit in this fertility industry. It's estimated to be worth nearly $5 billion by 2025. And this Swiss cheese, legal Swiss cheese around the world, is something that generally creates great opportunity for trade. And what happens is you start off initially with the concept of the best interests of the child being paramount. And when you have the two stakeholders, the industry itself and the industry users, defining law, this is reduced to, or downgraded to, the welfare of the child is taken into consideration as far as practicable. Who defines the welfare of the child, and what principles are those based on? It seems that there's a very shaky notion of even what the welfare, the best interest of the child is one thing, but now it's become the welfare, and actually what that means is just incredibly slippery. It's just a way of glossing over the idea that our interests are somehow covered, but ultimately I don't believe they are. Normally in practices that involve children, it's usual in law to state that the best interests of the child are paramount, owing to their special vulnerability and our inability to speak for ourselves in that situation. The child's rights to have their natural family recognized and protected by law has now been reduced to a child's family being contracted and fortified by law. What happens in that process is whilst a non-genetic relative is given legal status as our family, a genetic relative has that status taken away. So ultimately, people are brought into recognition, but the other side of the coin is the large percentage of our genetic family is brought out of legal recognition for the purpose of the industry. The consequences in terms of, lots of people talk about the take-home baby rate is the outcome that's being tested. Happy families go home with their take-home baby rate, and it's all considered a great outcome. But the actual long-term consequences tend to really kick in much later in life. For me, they started in my 20s, and I'm 45 now, and the journey's not stopped. And the impact for my children as well. Every time I have to go and take them, recently we've had scares of my daughter, this is my daughter Olive, potentially having diabetes. My son has just developed some interesting and slightly concerning issues with his heart. And when I go to a pediatrician and they ask me my medical history, the sense of fury that I have that I'm in a situation that was intentionally created by doctors. There is no way that my best interests and the best interests of the future generations were taken into consideration appropriately when we were denied knowledge of at least our medical history and a way to keep that updated. I'm not saying donor conception is fine and well if you have access to your medical history, but it's an example of the fact that you cannot trust the industry and the industry users to define and defend our interests, because for the last 100 years they've failed. What we need now is a paradigm shift in reproductive technology away from adult-centric treatment and applying normative standards to protecting the best interests of the child. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We know what's in the best interest of the child. In law, we've always said that being known and raised by your genetic family matters. If it matters for some, it matters for all. If it doesn't matter, then let it not matter for everyone. Just everybody give birth, and anybody can take home any baby from that ward. It doesn't matter, right? Or protect it for all. We need multidisciplinary protections to counter this conflict of interest from the industry and the industry users. We need an acknowledgement that this is a social experiment, and ultimately, there is nowhere for the people to turn when the experiment is going wrong and hurting us. And yet, they still assume it's going very well. So we need a central point for accountability and responsivity for those adversely affected. We need apology, new laws consistently applied internationally, and reparations and services to address and help reverse the consequences created for donor offspring. And finally, I'm hoping that we can respect the kinship identity, genetic identity for all groups in society, and not seek to sell that from a special group. Thank you for your time.